Mare. Before the nightmare was a bad dream, it was a creature sitting on your chest. The mare comes from Germanic and Scandinavian tradition and predates the modern concept of the nightmare by over 1,000 years. The word nightmare contains her name directly, night, mare, the mare of the night. Most people have never made that connection, which means they've been carrying her name around without knowing it. She visited sleeping humans by sitting on their chests, inducing a specific paralysis, the inability to move, the inability to cry out, the crushing weight on the sternum that anyone who has experienced sleep paralysis will recognize immediately. She didn't just cause bad dreams, she rode them into your head and steered. In some traditions, she was a living woman whose spirit left her body while she slept and traveled to torment others, completely unaware of what she was doing. You could identify a mare by finding the woman who always looked exhausted in the mornings, as if she had been working all night, which she had. Sleep paralysis affects roughly 8% of the general population. The experience of a presence, a weight, an entity in the room is one of the most consistently reported features across every culture that has documented it. The mare didn't cause sleep paralysis. She was the explanation humans built for something that was already happening and had no other name. Succubus and Incubus. The succubus and incubus are not simply medieval inventions about sexual temptation. They are a formal theological problem that occupied some of the most serious thinkers of the medieval church for 3 centuries. The succubus visited men at night. The incubus visited women. Both appeared in the form of an idealized version of what their target most desired, which is a considerably more sophisticated form of predation than claws and teeth. The goal was not simply to cause pleasure, it was to cause dependency, to make the victim prefer the visitation to waking life, gradually withdrawing from food, from company, from daylight, from everything that constituted an ordinary human existence. Thomas Aquinas discussed them. The Malleus Maleficarum, the 15th century manual for witch hunters, treated them as documented fact. Sinners were said to have entered pacts with them voluntarily, which raised the uncomfortable legal question of whether someone who handed over their will deserved the church's protection. The theological consensus, after considerable debate, was yes, because a mind that had been sufficiently worked on was no longer operating freely. It had been taken. Whether you interpret the succubus as a supernatural entity or as the medieval framework for understanding obsessive ideation, the underlying insight is the same. Desire, directed and amplified by something external, can override everything else you thought you valued. Medieval theologians understood that centuries before behavioral psychology gave it a different name. Most possession myths involve a demon taking over a body and the original person disappearing entirely. The Dybbuk does something worse. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is the soul of a dead person, specifically a person who died with unfinished business, unresolved sin, or uncompleted purpose, that attaches itself to a living host and refuses to leave. It doesn't replace the host's consciousness, it adds itself to it. The host remains aware. They can observe what is happening. They simply cannot stop it. Dybbukim were exercised through a formal rabbinical procedure called a din Torah, literally a court case, in which the possessing spirit was brought before a tribunal of 10 scholars, its grievances were heard, and a judgment was issued requiring it to leave. The process treated the dead soul as a legal entity with rights and complaints, which says something remarkable about how seriously the tradition took the idea that the dead might have legitimate reasons for holding on. The word Dybbuk comes from the Hebrew root meaning to cling or to adhere. It doesn't invade, it attaches. There's a difference, and the tradition understood that difference precisely. Kuchisake-Onna. Kuchisake-Onna is not ancient. She appeared in Japan in 1979 as an urban legend that spread so quickly through elementary schools that several school districts issued official warnings and some temporarily suspended outdoor activities. Police departments in multiple prefectures filed reports. She was treated for several weeks as a potential public safety issue. She is a woman with a surgical mask. common and unremarkable in Japan, who approaches people alone at night and asks a single question, "Am I beautiful?" If you say no, she kills you. If you say yes, she removes the mask, revealing a mouth that has been cut from ear to ear, and asks again, "Am I beautiful now?" If you say no, she kills you. If you say yes, she kills you anyway, but more slowly. The creature's power is entirely cognitive. She forces you into a decision framework where every available answer is wrong, and the act of engaging with the question at all is what traps you. You cannot think your way out because the thinking is the trap. Several escape strategies circulate in Japanese schoolyard tradition, saying she is average, answering the question with a question, naming a specific medical condition to confuse her long enough to run. None of them are guaranteed. All of them require the presence of mind to perform while standing in front of something that has just removed its face. She was almost certainly invented by children, which is not a reason to dismiss her. Children build the monsters that name the fears adults have stopped admitting they still carry. Leyak, Bali has one of the richest and most sophisticated mythological traditions in Southeast Asia, and its most feared creature is one that specifically targets healers. The Leyak is a practitioner of black magic who has taken their study far enough that they can detach their head from their body at night, float through the village with their organs trailing beneath them, and enter homes to consume the life force of sleeping victims. They look during the day like anyone else, a neighbor, a relative, someone you have known for years. What makes the Leyak uniquely interesting is its relationship to knowledge. In Balinese tradition, the same texts that teach healing also contain instructions that, pursued too far in the wrong direction, lead to becoming a Leyak. The line between medicine and corruption is not a wall, it is a gradient. And the Leyak is what happens when someone crosses it so gradually they don't notice until they're already on the other side. Balinese society maintains a tradition of specialized practitioners called Balian, who are trained to identify and counter Leyak activity. This is not folklore in the distant past tense. Consultations still happen. The tradition is current. The Leyak controls minds not through supernatural compulsion, but through the more ordinary mechanism of gradual compromise. The idea that expertise, pursued without ethical constraint, eventually becomes the thing it was supposed to prevent. Every profession has a version of this story. Bali just gave it a floating head. Baku. The Baku eats nightmares, which sounds like a good thing. It is not entirely a good thing. In Japanese mythology, the Baku is a chimeric creature, elephant's trunk, tiger's paws, ox's tail, the eyes of a rhinoceros, and it has the ability to consume bad dreams on request. If you wake from a nightmare and call out, "Baku, come eat my dream," 3 times before the images fade, the Baku will devour the nightmare and you will sleep peacefully. The problem is that the Baku, like most things that consume on demand, has a tendency to keep consuming after the nightmare is gone. If it is called when there is no nightmare left to eat, it will eat ordinary dreams instead, then ambitions, then hopes, leaving the person in a state of complete motivational vacancy, alive, functional, entirely empty of the drive to want anything. The instruction in traditional Japanese sources is clear. Call the Baku only when the nightmare is serious. Do not summon it out of mild discomfort. Do not make a habit of it, which is, if you strip away the chimeric creature and the ritual invocation, essentially the same warning attached to every substance and process that humans have ever developed for making bad feelings stop faster than they naturally would. The Baku predates the concept of psychological dependency by roughly 1,000 years. The mechanism it describes is identical. Mare di notte / Striga. The Striga is Roman, and she is one of the oldest documented mind-affecting creatures in Western literature. Horace wrote about her. Ovid described her in detail. Pliny the Elder included her in his Natural History as a category of real creature requiring practical countermeasures, alongside his entries on lions and elephants. She was a night-flying creature that took the form of a bird, specifically an owl, and visited infants and young children to drain their blood and their vitality over successive nights. The child would not be found dead, they would be found gradually diminished, quieter each morning, less present, eating less, responding less, drifting toward an absence that was not quite death, but was indistinguishable from its approach. The Romans treated the Striga as a medical diagnosis as much as a supernatural threat. There were specific herbs, specific doorway treatments, specific rituals for the threshold of a house where an infant slept. The Striga's method, gradual depletion rather than sudden attack, made her harder to recognize and harder to stop than anything that struck once and left evidence. She was the creature that explained why some children simply faded, why the cause could never be named, why all the correct things had been done and none of them had been enough. In Italian, the word strega still means witch. She never entirely left. Penanggalan. Malaysia and much of maritime Southeast Asia share a creature that is structurally similar to the Leyak, but specifically targets one category of victim: pregnant women and the children they are about to deliver. The Penanggalan is a woman, always a woman, whose head detaches from her body at night with the stomach and intestinal organs trailing beneath it, vinegar-soaked to shrink them small enough to reattach by morning. She moves through the night, searching for women in labor and newborns, feeding on the blood of the vulnerable. What makes the Penanggalan genuinely interesting as a cultural artifact is the specific anxiety it encodes. Childbirth in pre-modern Southeast Asia carried mortality rates that modern medicine has made it easy to forget. The period between a child's conception and its first weeks of life was genuinely the most dangerous stretch of existence for both mother and infant. The Penanggalan gave that danger a face, a motivation, and a set of countermeasures. Iron nails at the windows, prickly plants along the walls whose thorns would catch the trailing organs, which meant it also gave communities a sense of agency over something that otherwise had none. You cannot protect against randomness. You can protect against a creature with known behaviors and documented weaknesses. The Penanggalan is what fear looks like after a culture has decided it would rather have a monster to fight than a probability to accept. Encantado. The Amazon River produces a specific kind of story. The Encantado, from Brazilian and wider Amazonian tradition, is a river dolphin, specifically the pink boto dolphin native to the Amazon basin that can transform into a beautiful, charming human at night. It emerges from the water, attends festivals and dances, and targets the most attractive person present. It does not use force. It uses charm. It is, by all accounts, an exceptional dancer. The person who catches the Encantado's attention finds themselves in what seems, at the time, like an unusually intense and unusually fast-moving romantic connection. They begin spending less time with their family, less time in familiar places. Their attention narrows toward the river, toward the water, toward whatever it is they believe they are moving toward. And then they disappear into the river and are not seen again. The Encantado always wears a hat, even while dancing, because it cannot conceal the blowhole on top of its head. This is the kind of detail that separates a well-constructed mythology from a careless one. The Encantado is irresistible and nearly perfect, and detectable only by the single small thing it cannot quite hide. The tradition is saying, "Charm this comprehensive always has one tell." The problem is that by the time you're close enough to see the hat, you've already agreed to dance. Wendigo Psychosis. The Wendigo has appeared on this channel before, but in a different context. Here, the relevant detail is not the creature itself, it is the diagnosis. Wendigo psychosis is a documented cultural-bound syndrome recognized in Algonquian-speaking communities, the Ojibwe, Cree, and Innu, among others, in which an individual becomes convinced that they are transforming into the Wendigo. They develop an overwhelming craving for human flesh, even in the presence of adequate food. They describe the craving as external, as something being imposed on them from outside their own will, as a force taking over the body they still recognize as their own. The communities that recognized this syndrome did not treat it as metaphor. They developed formal ceremonial responses. Elders were consulted. Rituals were performed. In documented historical cases, individuals who believed they were transforming petitioned to be killed before the transformation completed, on the grounds that what they were becoming was no longer them, and they did not want to be present for what it would do. Western psychiatry spent decades arguing about whether Wendigo psychosis was real or culturally performed. The current consensus, to the extent there is one, is that the question is framed incorrectly. The experience was real. The framework for understanding it was cultural. Both things are true simultaneously. The Wendigo is a creature that takes over from the inside. What makes it the most disturbing entry on this list is that the people it took over knew exactly what was happening. They watched themselves change. They asked for help. They tried to stop it. And sometimes that was not enough. 10 creatures, 10 cultures, 1 fear. The Mare pressing down in the dark. The Dybbuk clinging to a host that can still see everything and stop nothing. The Kuchisake-Onna and her question you cannot answer correctly. The Encantado and its perfect charm and its single hidden tell. None of these are stories about being overpowered by something stronger than you. They're stories about being redirected, reprogrammed, turned against your own interests by something that understood you well enough to use your own mind as the mechanism. That fear has not aged. It has not been explained away by science or rationalized out of existence by modernity. If anything, the language we now have for it, manipulation, coercive control, compulsive behavior, the slow erosion of autonomous thought, makes the old stories easier to understand, not harder. The creatures changed. The thing they were describing didn't. Drop a comment with which one got to you most. I read every single one.